everyone. It's nice to meet people, and I wish I had more time to find out who some of you are. Maybe in the future that's possible. I'm going to go rather quickly because I have 90 slides. And so I may go quickly, and it's fine if there's something you want to know more about. I can probably provide more information. I've also asked George Whitehouse to chime in a couple of places, knowing that I'm on a tight time frame here, but he has personal firsthand knowledge of some events that I do not. So let's begin. Okay. I love these old prints from the 20s. They really show a different view of the church than the way I'm used to seeing it from the Back Bay side down Boylston Street. Again, we talked about that railing on the church, as well as some other protuberances that are quite different than what you see today. So these just great old woodcuts. We have had a lot of senior ministers at Arlington Street. I was looking at this list today, and we've had several who served quite a while. The beloved Paul Revere Frothingham, the first quarter century. Reverend Dana McLean Greeley, Kim's mentor. He served from 1936 to 1959. And then Kim has served probably longer than all of those if you just passed 30 a couple of years ago. So we've also had some other outstanding people whom we will talk about. And there was even a time that I don't mention later on called Ministry by the Members. What's important to know there is the church was having very hard times, and the UUA and the district jumped in to help keep the church open. Phyllis Richter of beloved memory used to tell me stories about meeting in the chapel or downstairs in some small room because they could barely afford to heat the church. But they rallied with the support of the larger organization and grew back to become a vibrant church. So onward here. Paul Revere Frothingham is one of my all-time favorites. He was a real social justice guy. He never married. He was a social justice guy. He married late in life, didn't have any kids, but his idea of a really fun honeymoon was taking his wife on a tour of settlement houses in England. And one of the things I remember reading about him is, in addition to his interests in labor, in spite of coming from a very Boston Brahmin lineage that included many significant ministers, he encouraged his debutantes of the day to go work in the settlement houses in the North End. And he tried very, very hard to get his well-heeled parishioners to understand what life was like outside of Newbury Street and Beacon Street and Beacon Hill, which is what they probably spent their life in, those environs. So there's a lot more that we could say about him. I gave a sermon many years ago that's probably in the archives about labor. Paul Revere Frothingham did his first ministry before Arlington Street in New Bedford, and he worked closely with Catholics, especially Catholic priests and Catholic churches, for the rights of the local workers. So at the time, Arlington Street was such a different environment, but he brought his views here. He died, sadly, rather young. I think they expected to have him for another 10 or 15 years, but he died in 1926. Okay. This gives you a sense of Arlington Street without a traffic jam and some lovely carriages. I think it's around 1900. Without being able to see the Channing statue, we don't know whether it's before or after 1903, but I love this picture, and I love how clean and bright the whole thing looks. Here is a picture from maybe just a little bit later showing the above ground streetcars. And most of you who've read the murals in the subway have seen the stories about the history of how it was initially one block down around Park Street, and they slowly added the subway and extended it out. But there were many above ground trolleys at the time. And you can see that contrasted with a horse-drawn carriage in the snow. And at this time, all the buildings along Boylston Street looks like residences. We did not yet own this building until I think the 1940s, which we owned from the 1940s till the 80s. We're at the Parish Cafe today. So Here's another building. There was a big incline in the middle of Boylston Street, and that's where the subway went underground. So it came up and became a above level trolley. I can't imagine preaching without a microphone with trolleys going by all the time above ground. You can see how little the public garden has still grown at this time and how wide the streets are. Apparently they had no parking problem at this time. The church is covered with ivy, which some of our people have told me is actually very bad for brownstone, but there was a period at the beginning of the 20th century when ivy was all over the church, and I'm told it was very carefully taken off and kept off. You also can see a Coca-Cola sign back there. 1903 was a very important date for our congregation. That was the date that the Channing statue across the street was erected. The trees are so different today. They tower over the statue. But at that time, it was erected and the pulpit was lower then. So you could see right out the great doors to the statue. It commemorates the 1803 ordination of William Ellery Channing over at Federal Street, our previous location. Federal Street at the time when he was ordained and installed. So this was the centennial of his ordination. And in 2003, we reenacted Channing's ordination for GA in Boston. And that was quite an event too. But I love this picture. It's an old postcard. And the interior of the building was extremely different until 1911. The pulpit was very low. And the work in back of the pulpit was extremely different. It wasn't curved. You can see the beautiful contrasting paintwork from after 1911. I'm pretty sure it was all white, so you would just see the relief. I did some research many years ago, and the color that they used for contrast was terracotta. Now, there's no stained glass windows until 1898, the first one, the Madonna of the Flowers in the left front goes in. So the sanctuary was full of light. And as the windows went in, it did start to get progressively darker. I'll tell you about I think I'll mention the 1911 renovation now. It was during Paul Revere Frothingham's time. The church was growing. It was very well-off congregation. Windows were coming in on a regular basis to memorialize important people in the congregation. And they raised the pulpit about 8 feet. I could be a little bit off there, but quite a bit. And then they completely changed the chancel to what you know today. They also did some early technology, like I read about a phone being installed. I think this was just one line to one other line so that the minister could give cues to the organist via telephone. You'll also notice that the Channing and Gannett portraits were originally at the front of the church, and after 1911, they were moved to the back. This, of course, is the beloved Madonna of the Flowers, the first Tiffany window to go in, the guiled window. If people wanted, and if I could somehow get a hold of all my old notebooks, I could give a talk on each of the Tiffany windows and the donor families, but that would be a whole hour by itself. And I'd need to get down there when COVID's more under control and look at my research notes. But that's a possibility perhaps for next year because it's a fascinating story, all these families. So this is the scaffolding in the 1911 renovation. Some of you may remember later renovations, and the scaffolding certainly got more sophisticated by the end of the century. The other interesting thing I learned is they closed the church and sent all the staff to Europe for a year. The minister and quite a few staff members, they all went to Europe for a year while the church was closed. Not a bad deal. One of the most important historical items we have are these, we have a couple of different handbooks of the church. They're lengthy documents, and they tell us quite a bit about the day-to-day life of the church. It's easy to find meeting minutes and orders of service and all the formal things, but they managed to include quite a bit about the committees and some of the social justice initiatives, about the silver that we had, about windows, about programs. I really love these, and they're in the archives. I decided to include an order of service for April 1917. It's very detailed. There's a lovely drawing that kind of makes the church look like a shrine. And you can see that the church is open every day from 9 till 4. That must have been quite an undertaking. We had Reverend Frothingham as the senior minister, but he had a wonderful assistant who shows up all through the history, a woman by the name of Harriet Johnson. I'm sure she would have been a minister. It really was less possible right about this time, and that's another long story. Women were really encouraged into the ministry in the late 19th century, but by the early 20th century, some of the UUA administrators, like a certain Samuel Atkins Elliott, who you'll hear more about later, was not encouraging women into the ministry so much. He was encouraging them to go into RE or other service. You can also see that the choral pieces for the month were laid out in detail. And one interesting item, let's see if I can point to it, you'll see Reverend Abraham Mitri Rabbani of the Church of the Disciples. The Church of the Disciples merged with Arlington Street after the death of James Freeman Clark. There was another minister named Ames, Charles Gordon Ames. And Mitri Rabbani was the third minister, and he's a great story unto himself. He was born in Syria in the poorest of conditions, like dirt floor shack, and they were part of a silk raising community. And he got to New York with like 25 cents in his pocket as a young man. He found his way through to one of the colleges, Oberlin perhaps, and he went on to a spectacular ministerial career, ending up in a prominent Boston church. And he's one of the big portraits, if it's still there, right near the stairs to the second floor in the addition. So I'd love to talk about Church of the Disciples sometime. That's an important story. And John Behrens has a new book about it, new a year ago. Here's another interesting picture. You got the Coca-Cola sign. The Channing statue is very visible, although there aren't very many trees. Again, I'm guessing early 1920s. You can see some of the other church steeples, and of course the cars of the era. And here now we're getting a little bit more of a traffic jam on Arlington Street. From the cars, I don't know anything about these cars, but people have told me 1920s seems about right. There weren't a lot of differences. And these are the memorial doors to Paul Revere Frothingham. And you'll notice that it says beloved minister of this church. He really was. He was a very charismatic, carrying the social justice orientation that I mentioned. So look at that memorial when you walk through those doors and appreciate all he did for this church. Well, I mentioned Samuel Atkins Elliott because he had been the president of the American Unitarian Association on Beacon Hill. He also came from a long line of Unitarian ministers, and I think his father was prominent president of Harvard, Charles Elliott. The Elliots were everywhere in Boston and Boston Unitarian world. He came to Arlington Street when Paul Revere Frothingham died rather suddenly. He retired from presidency of the AUA at the time. We weren't connected with the Universalists till 1861. And he stayed with us for about 9 years, but he did have the wisdom to see that we needed a younger minister because he was not drawing families, which was great wisdom. I don't much like his policy about discouraging women from becoming ministers, but at Arlington Street, his great wisdom really paid off for the church. And some important things happened at the church during his tenure. He was the one who developed the chapel, 1928. It's kind of hard to read here, but it's in the archives. And you can see this is from the Boston Evening transcripts. They had somebody in to draw the chapel. And it was quite formal and greatly expanded church programming and church school programming. Here's another order of service featuring one of the beautiful Tiffany windows from 1935 during his time. And what was so important about his ministry is in realizing we needed a younger minister. They went about as young as they could get. From what I understand, Dana McLean Greeley was 26 years old when he was called to the church. And I remember hearing a story many years ago where they said, well, how will you manage being such a young minister? And he said, I think that's one thing that time will take care of. So it did. He started out as a very young man. He'd had a short pastorate in Concord, New Hampshire, and did very well. And he came and he definitely drew families. The Sunday school during the 1940s was enormous. People came who weren't even members of the church. He quickly developed ecumenical relationships with clergy, and not just Christian clergy, but he often would have an Islamic leader, a rabbi, people from all the faiths represented in Boston on a podium with him, giving him talk about what the city needed. He was deeply committed to the city. And interestingly, he was a pacifist during World War II. Dan Sheaver, of beloved memory, a longtime ASC member, told me that not all Unitarians were pacifists. Most, like Dan himself, felt like it was very important to stop Hitler at the borders or before he got to the US. But Greeley was a committed pacifist. And so I think people coexisted in the church, both pacifists and people who felt like they had to go to war in World War II. Later on, he served in the Concord Mass Church when, I don't know how old you were, Kim. I'm thinking 12, 13. Yeah, she says, yeah. And inspired her and encouraged her to ministry. So it's a very connected story here. And his family were very active in the church. 4 daughters, one or two of them married Unitarian ministers. People spoke of his wife with the greatest admiration. Her name was Debbie. And she was very active in the parish, as ministers' wives so often were. So he left us to become president of the AUA, and then the joint merged Unitarians and Universalists. So he was really the first president of the merged denominations before going to the Concord Church. He's somebody I greatly admire. Now, the church looked very different. We had a very prominent cross, and it's quite beautiful. But after Greeley, Reverend Greeley's term, it was taken down. George Whitehouse, am I correct that you personally brought it to some nuns down on the Cape, and they are still appreciating it?
Yes.
Anything more to say about that?
Carolyn Mcdade. It went somewhere after that, and it's been lost.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. I'm glad we have this picture.
It's not, and it's also all wood. It looks brass, but it's not.
So it's painted to look like brass, but it's wood. And the hangings are quite fancy in the front of the church. This must have been perhaps decorated for Easter, but it's quite beautiful. And this might have been how it looked when it wasn't decorated. At the time, the communion table, when I left in 2019, was down on the side in the front for candles. But this was the traditional communion table that came from the Scots-Irish Presbyterians. So at the time they had, covers, fancy covers for it. And then the pulpit had fancy hangings and covers. This was pretty traditional for a formal church in the 50s. And I believe, I don't know so much, but Dana Greeley was certainly a Christian Unitarian. And that was very common in that era. And there are certainly still some today. There was an event in 1954 that put the church on the front of many newspapers, a terrible hurricane. It knocked our weather vane off. You can see the headline there, Hurricane Topples Weather Vane. And a tree and street lights were blocking Arlington Street. So that's quite a cleanup mess. Well, this is one of my favorite pictures ever. A tall story, but a true one. That is a steeplejack on top of the church assessing how a new weather vane would be installed. And you'll see something about that many, many years later toward the end of my talk. Hurricane Edna was the name of that terrible storm that caused the weather vane to need to be replaced. This I think this must be the new one that they're looking at, because I doubt the old one would have come down in such pristine condition. George, do you know any of the people in this picture?
No.
Yeah, I don't see Reverend Greeley there either. I'm suspecting it's some of the people on the Prudential Committee and perhaps somebody who is a steeplejack. But it's sitting there on the front steps, and you can see how large it is compared to how it looks from the ground. Okay, in the 1940s, when Reverend Greeley was bringing so many to the church acquired the building that's now the Parish Cafe, assuming it still is, that hasn't changed. And there were connecting doors that are now blocked off on all the floors in the parish house. And it greatly expanded the meeting rooms, the church school rooms. As I understand it, on a Sunday, the place was packed. Hundreds of kids in the church school at one point, even from non-church members. So in this, I don't know the date of this. This is probably 70s or 80s, but I don't have a date on this.
Parish Cafe is in the building next door to that, the one.
Oh, it is?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
And this building is still looking some without the Arlington Street Church sign, but it still looks somewhat like that.
Okay, my mistake. Thank you for correcting me.
Okay.
And there are some very interesting historic photos that were taken, I think, by the Historic American Building Survey. They took like every 20 feet up and down many of the Back Bay streets. So you can see, looking toward the church, it's quite a commercial group of shops there, even though it may have been residences up above. Here's the church staff. Reverend Greeley is in the middle, in the back, quite recognizable. And the Minister Emeritus, Samuel Atkins Elliott, is with him. I believe these were all church staff. As people used to joke, women in comfortable shoes. I got to admire that, but all decked out in their suits for a staff picture. And I love this one for several reasons. This shows Reverend Greeley accepting the offering. It looks like a posed picture. It may have been before church actually opened, but I love the fact that there's somebody who's not white in the picture, because there's very little evidence of very many people who weren't white who were actively involved in the church. Be great if somebody would find out who that is, do some research, and let us know why he was drawn to the church. And so wonderful that he was an usher, because that was quite a prominent role. I guess those of you who like to usher are glad you don't have to wear your carnations to do it. George actually told me about this. In the 1950s, the building was surveyed, and it was determined that it was spreading a little bit. So those aren't just for hanging pride banners. Those are actually tie rods to preserve the building. They go across, and then they're tied into the ceiling. So you may have wondered what those were. Musical theater was huge. These large these families joined the church school was large. When I came to ASC in around 1994, the drama program was still thriving. Ann Carpenter is still around. Lots of people know her. She was in almost every production. George and Gaby were in quite a few. I saw your names early on. Many people of beloved memory acted. There was Gilbert and Sullivan. There were passion plays. Even though the stage downstairs isn't particularly elaborate, this program thrived for, I want to say, 50 years. I think in the early 2000s, there was fewer people who were interested or something. I don't know why it didn't continue quite so much as it had. Okay, oops. I'm just trying to say, I'm afraid I skipped something. No, I didn't. Okay, after Dana Greeley left to go to the UUA, the merged denominations, the church called somebody who was less typical and certainly not a Boston Brahmin, Jack Mendelsohn. I'm grateful that I got to meet him a couple times. One time he was sharing the pulpit with Kim, and I was sitting in the office doing some task, and I got to chat with him that day for quite a while. And he was so interested in what I was doing with the history and asked me all kinds of questions, and said he was really glad that someone younger at the time, I was probably in my 40s, was taking an interest in the history, and it just meant a lot to me to meet him. But his heritage was Jewish, and he had had other pastorates. He was very radical. He was willing to turn the Brahmins and many other Boston institutions on their ears to make a stand for racial justice or city justice, or to allow birth control to be discussed. There were a lot of real conservative Bostonians that were trying to keep a stranglehold on Boston in many ways that were not liberal. And he fought them all the time. He had no trouble. He was behind the anti-war activities. He was just an amazing person to be called after all these relatively conservative ministers. He was here with us for about 10 years, and then he moved on, I think, to Chicago. He either came from Chicago or went to Chicago, but his works were way beyond anything I can mention. Here he is doing a program called Black Power Comes to Boston. And one interesting emphasis, I was looking back at some of the clippings today, there was a strong emphasis at this time of putting the Black community into leadership themselves, not a situation of noblesse oblige, like you show up and we'll tell you how to run things in the city. Putting Black people into leadership in the South End, in Roxbury. John and Wendy Ellerton, I don't know if they're on tonight, but they were very connected with all of this. And I think they came after Mendelsohn's time, but not too long after, maybe 70s or 80s. But there was so much sense of self-determination, something that is so prevalent today in anti-racist work. 1961 was a very important anniversary of the church building itself, which was opened in 1861 at the beginning of the Civil War. There were many celebrations and a great deal of history was done at this time. I love this picture because you'll see the church model that is still in the plexiglass case, probably in the chapel. But here it is with people dressed up to represent the Scots-Irish Presbyterians, the early ministers, probably Channing, the important women in the congregation we talked about in the 19th century. Somebody even has a rifle there. I'm thinking it must have been the early people who maybe had to do that to get to church. I don't know, but that was quite a historical celebration. I can only wish there was a video. And here's George back in the day. This picture is probably from the early 90s because I took it. But what's important is, George, you can correct me here. You and your roommate at MIT decided that it would be exciting to restore the bells because they had not been heard for many years. And I believe you tied it to this 100th anniversary. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, it was for the laying of the cornerstone on December 11th. 1861. So we decided we'd work 2.5 years. And the person I worked with was a direct descendant of Jeremy Belknap.
Wow.
And we did it. At Christmas, when people went to church, they heard, "O come, all ye faithful."
Okay, well, that was such an important contribution because our bells are one of the most beloved ways we reach out to the community.
The 16 bells when they were put in 1861 was the largest collection of bells anywhere in the United States as a chime, not a carillon, but a chime.
There was a brief time when they were electrified, I want to say in the early part of the 20th century,
yes.
But that did not last, and they are played by hand today. So that was George in the 90s playing.
They had stopped bringing, there were only about 5 or 6 that were working in 1942 when John Woodworth came. So they were silent most of the time.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, I love this picture. The people who've been with us longer will recognize our beloved Dan Sheaver as quite a young man in 1962. He was away in Pittsburgh as a professor for a long time, but at this time he was in Boston, and I love the title somebody affixed to this, 12 Good Men and True. I don't know when women started being on significant committees and the Prudential Committee, but it would be well worth researching because this is a group of white male faces under Channing's portrait. Now, this is what the women got to do. They got to be hostesses for the canvas. Here they are at Eleanor Ames's house. I'm not sure which one she is, but she was a very long time member of the church. I believe she lived in a lovely place in the Back Bay, probably was Eleanor Ames related to Charles Gordon Ames, George? Do you know? Yeah, I don't know. But she is training all the hostesses to do the work of the canvas while the men strategize the nuts and bolts of the bottom line, I would guess. Pretty different. Here is another picture of Jack Mendelsohn. He's here meeting with some of his senior people. I'm glad to see more women in the picture. And behind here, you'll see Dana Greeley's portrait, the one that I imagine is still in Kim's office, Jeremy Belknap's portrait, and part of John Moorhead's portrait, the founding Presbyterian. Now, when we did the big capital campaign, I want to say we had to do one in 1996 rather unexpectedly because bricks were falling off the steeple. People asked me to do a lot of research. And at the time, many of us were saying we haven't had a capital campaign since 1911. I did not find this scrapbook until after that time. And here we see the evidence of scaffolding and $165,000 facelift. Well, nevertheless, between 1962 and 1996, things got to be in pretty tough condition. The 1996 story is that I don't think we actually had a brick fall off, but somebody from probably Goody Clancy came to examine the building and said, these bricks are so loose that you've got to do steeple work now, or you are going to be having pieces of the steeple falling. So I was glad to correct that fact because you'll find publicity from the 1990s and 2000s that say it hasn't been touched since 1911, which is what we believed. Here's an interesting picture. The church celebrated Palm Sunday. There's Jack Mendelsohn in a robe. I don't remember too many Palm Sunday celebrations, maybe in a token kind of way, but here we're seeing the real palms and Jack in the pulpit. George, do you want to comment on losing the insurance? You're the one who actually told me about that the first time. We actually lost the insurance at a time during Mendelsohn's tenure when the church was involved in many controversial events.
It was because of the Vietnam resistor that was in the church.
Okay.
So it lasted 2.5 years.
And the church was having a terrible time. Gaby, you've actually talked about night watch and spending nights in the church with some of the young women hippies during this time. Mm-hmm. We have really good information in the archives. We have a lot of great newspaper clippings. I saved tons of clippings when I first got involved in archives. They had gotten wet. We had two problems. We had wetness in what used to be the archives room, the Carol Smith room, and a lot of clippings were in there. And then we had a huge water break in the prop room that we lost tons of materials, a lot of old photos and such. But I was able to get a bunch of wet clippings and lay them out in a room of Tori's in my house for, I want to say, a year. And we dried them all out and we're finally able to read them. I'm amazed that newsprint survived that being wet, but they did. And Ed Harris was an interim minister. He had been the associate with Jack Mendelsohn, and I think he served as interim for a year until the next minister was called, which is quite a story. Oh yeah, just another note on Mendelsohn. He was perfectly willing to call the city on things that weren't going in a just way. This is very typical. I love this. Many white liberals are childishly sulking in their tents of righteousness because Negroes insist on leading their own fight for a better life rather than riding on the coattails of white benefactors. He did not mince words. And the clippings and scrapbooks of the time he was very press-worthy because he was controversial. So if anybody ever wanted to research him, it would make a great book or dissertation. Yeah, Selma, this is huge for us. When I first came in the 90s, the Hardenbergs were still active, Dan and Marianne, and they were with James Reeve and his wife the night before James Reeve went to Selma. And what I remember them telling me is they were agonizing. James Reeve, he was a minister, but he served as a community minister. So he and his family attended Arlington Street. He was not one of our clergy members, but he was a member of the UU clergy, just serving in a community role. And he was agonizing. He really wanted to go to Selma. He felt called. It was on his heart. And Dan and Marianne said his wife did not want him to go. Her name was Marie. They had 4 children. She was frightened. She was willing to live in Roxbury, in the inner city, in some of the toughest neighborhoods, and send her kids to local schools, but she was not comfortable with the trip to Selma. He decided he had to go. He couldn't not go. So this is a brief timeline. Martin Luther King and his associates planned the campaign. Jimmy Lee Jackson is very important because he is African-American. He's not necessarily UU, but he shot and died. And this was the catalyst for planning the March to Montgomery. The first march was the one known as Bloody Sunday. I wish I could spend more time on this, but it's all out there for you to read. The Ministers' March was planned. Again, I think they had to turn back. James Reeve and 2 other ministers were leaving a cafe where they had dinner in Selma, and they were beaten by some white people. He was walking on the outside. The others were Clark Olson, and I'm drawing a blank on the other one. Anyway, it's all well documented, especially on the UUA site.
Olaf Miller.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you. And I told you, I think I mentioned in one of my other talks, or I may have been talking to somebody else, that they tried to get him some health care after he was hurt. His head was bleeding. They took an ambulance. Somebody in the Black community found them an ambulance. Nobody in the local city would help them. They took a long 2-hour drive. I think it was to Montgomery. I forget which city it was. The ambulance broke down. They were worried about having people on their tail that would shoot all of them. You can read about this, but he finally dies. I believe his wife got there just in time to say goodbye. I believe President Johnson either sent her down on a plane or brought her back on his plane. The fact that a white minister was beaten and died reached people in a way that all the Black people who died sadly had not. This hit Congress. Johnson really embraced it. They finally marched through to Birmingham, March 21st through 25th. And Viola Liuzzo, who was a UU, is shot and died driving some of the people trying to register voters, help with Black voter registration. The 3 of these people are commemorated in a memorial at the UUA. It's a beautiful brass plaque commemorating these 3. But all of this was a catalyst for Congress finally passing the Voting Rights Act, 1965. So let me see here. This was a Globe article many years later. I want to say, I can't quite see it, but there have been many attempts to revisit what happened. There was an attempt to try those who had been acquitted at the time of Reeves' murder, half a century later. So this was 50 years later. We have a lot of material in the archives, not that different than what other archives would have, but it's a critically important story. He was from Wyoming. And so when I searched on the internet, I found that his local Wyoming papers had very closely followed this. They knew he was dying. And then Reverend Reeve dies from savage beating in Selma. This is a clipping from the Globe, I believe. It's the church during the memorial service for Reeve. And John Collins, the mayor of Boston at the time, was sitting in a wheelchair here. Herb Gleason of beloved memory, a very ardent justice worker and member of the church, often talked about his relationships with people on the city council, mayors, how he also carried on that work for justice in the city in so many ways, known and never known. That would be another good story, a long autobiography of Herb Gleason. Here's the church signboard at the time, quite different than any I remember, but Jack Mendelsohn preached the tribute to him. This is Marie Reeve. She was so young with 3 of her very young children. There was another child, but they were 5, 6, 13, and I think 1 in the middle. I guess she was devastated when all this happened. She took her family back to Wyoming. I think it took her a good 50 years. They invited her to GA sometime in the last 10 or 12 years, and she came. She's an elder now, and she came, and I think there was some important reconciliation between her and some of the others who were in Selma with her husband. It had been an extremely painful loss for their family. This is the beautiful plaque that was at the UUA in Boston and on Beacon Hill and now down in South Boston. On the left is Jimmy Lee Jackson. So I think they would call these the Selma Martyrs. These are some of the memorials. I think these may be in Selma itself. So important recognition that didn't come right away. James Reeve was lifted up in the early years because he was a white minister and his death reached so many, but in time, the woman and the Black man came to be included. Up on the upper left, this is the original memorial, but the building it was on was at risk. So I don't know if that's still there. There's James Reeve's own memorial, but what they did in Selma was commission this memorial with long-lasting plaques to the martyrs and some of the key events, because this building may have been in such poor condition they thought it would have to be taken down. I don't remember the exact story, but Selma, UUs have taken trips to Selma on bus trips. There have been a lot of educational trips. I'm sorry I never went on one, just to see the place with some of the people who were there. Here again is Dana Greeley. He was president of the UUA at the time. He's walking at the front of one of the marches after Reeve was killed. And again, he's next to a Catholic Monsignor, possibly. I think there were some Black ministers here. I think there's a nun at the far right. The clergy came together across all lines to honor the losses in Selma. Here's another picture. I think it's the same people. One important event happened. Some of you know Marshall Hawkins. I think we sponsored him when he was a divinity student. He's now over at Skinner Press. And he played Channing when we did the reenactment of Channing's ordination in 2003, and he did it wonderfully. We thought that King's eulogy for Reeve was lost. It was in a local Black church. Marshall Hawkins one day at the UUA discovered the tapes and retrieved them. And on the UUA website is both the audio, which is hard to hear, and a transcription of Reeve's memorialization of King's memorialization of James Reeve. So thank you, Marshall. Okay, and here's King on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I know they're thinking about renaming that bridge because he was a Confederate. I hope that happens. This is just a very brief excerpt from the King eulogy. We don't have time to look at it tonight, but I encourage you to go to the UUA and look it up. It's pretty easy to find. Okay, this is where I've got a great quote about our beloved George Whitehouse, who's happily still with us and still going strong. The hippies were quite a phenomenon in the late 60s, and I love this story. I'll read a little bit of it. The unofficial headquarters for those hippies who have braved Beantown is the Arlington Street Church. It's just around the corner from the Playboy Club. I hear you laughing. Across the street from the Public Garden and in direct line of the fixed stare of William Ellery Channing's statue. He preached with spiritual power and led a great advance towards Christian ideals, the inscription assures you, which stands in a pile of debris consisting mostly of busted wine bottles. That's sad. Inside the church, you'll find the Reverend George Whitehouse, who probably doesn't enjoy being called the hippie padre, but is anyway. He runs the Damaged Angel Coffeehouse and in general tries to be helpful to the hippies. Things are slow this year, Whitehouse says, sounding rather sad. Last summer, we were jammed and the response of most of the churches and agencies like the Y was to supply kids with food and clothes and create an atmosphere that made them feel at home. They weren't causing any trouble, or at least very little trouble, but the city was afraid, and some rather well-known people pressured the police to use selective harassment to clean up the city. I thought that was an awfully timely final quote this particular week. George, anything to add?
There was three of us called the God Squad. There was a Jesuit priest, a Catholic priest, and myself.
And was that a time when the young women were sleeping inside the sanctuary to protect them?
They were sleeping in the parish hall at night.
The parish hall, not the sanctuary. Yeah, I understand there was an awful lot of sexual tension, and I guess we'd say to abuse today for many of the young women. A lot of young people were drawn. We have some very interesting documents in the archives, which are the journals of the day-to-day work of the people who ran kind of an outreach and help center. I mean, people had a hard time getting messages from home back in the days of payphones. And in these logs, these long log books, they take messages for people. They take, somebody's looking for somebody else. Somebody needs a certain kind of medical help or transportation. Those are in our archives and they're gold mine of interesting information. Speaking of the Damaged Angel Coffeehouse, that's been in quite a few articles that I found in our archives. So here a folk guitarist entertains for students. I gather this attracted quite a few students, people living in the area. I like the quote, and that's only one of the services the Arlington Street Church provides for its congregation in meeting the needs of the community. I would have loved to have seen a coffee house, but that was before my time. This is a very famous picture in front of the church. I knew this picture either in high school, which would have been before 1970, when I was growing up in Western Mass, or I think it was before 1970, because people had posters of this. And I learned later that it was Arlington Street Church, but that was a popular slogan of the time due to the draft. George has corrected me many times. The draft cards were burned, but those who burned them were not taking the largest risk. Those who turned their draft cards in, they were sent somewhere in Washington, D.C., probably right to the FBI, and collected, and then they knew who you were. If you burned your draft card, that was nice and symbolic, but it didn't really cause you any trouble. So this is from 1967. That was when the famous baby Dr. Spock came and stood up for peace and anti-draft work. There were long trials after it. Arlington Street was on the front page of the newspaper almost every day for a long time. We have fabulous scrapbooks from this time. You can see the red underlines. I did not do that. That came from a clipping service that we subscribed to. And some of these were put in scrapbooks at the time, but I rescued a lot more that were not put in scrapbooks when I dried all the old clippings out. And Spock was so famous that it really brought the trial a great deal of attention. Okay, I said I would talk about the next minister. Several of you, Don Richter perhaps, George Ellerton's, I think many of you remember him. Walimu Imara came to us as Renford Gaines. Dana Greeley sponsored him, encouraged him. It was so hard for a Black minister to get a pulpit in a white Unitarian church. Mark Morrison Reed has written eloquently about this. I think Darkening the Doorways. He has a couple of different books, one of which I indexed for Skinner. You get to know a book very well when you do that. He writes a lot about the backdrop to this story, but the church decided in 1970 to call this Black minister, Renford Gaines, at the time. What people who have accepted a call tell me is you really want to be up above 90% in the vote to call you. I believe the call to him was somewhere down around 59%, if memory serves. Some of the congregation didn't feel that we were quite ready for it. They were okay with Jack Mendelsohn, who was quite the radical, but they weren't sure what it would be like to have a Black minister. So many people left when he came. Now, there are so many stories here, and they're painful stories. I think the best way to summarize this is he became increasingly politicized during his time with us. He took his African name. Gene Navius, also of beloved memory, summed it up for me the best when he said, I rode with him to a meeting about 2 hours away, and the whole time, Walimu raged at me for everything white people had ever done wrong. Now, Gene was a minister, and he knew how to take a lot of flack, as all clergy do who make it that far. But I can't imagine this minister raging at the white congregants, which I'm told also happened. To be sure, we were not awake about a lot of aspects of racial justice. There were many people in Boston who were trying, and there were many in Boston, like around the busing, who really would just as soon not hear about it and not be involved. So his heart was certainly in the right place, but from what I understood from Gene, who knew him well, is his anger sort of took over. It's a hard story to tell because you can't tell it in terms of who was right and who was wrong. This is what happened. By 1974, a lot of people were leaving. There was a lot of unhappiness. He decided to go work with people who are dying. He had a lot of skills in death and dying work. He'd worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. He went, I don't think he had another pulpit after this, but he did amazing work in the world. He did come and visit Herb Gleason, I want to say sometime in the early 2000s, and I did meet him briefly, but he declined to be interviewed by me, much as I would have loved to have heard his thoughts many years after. But he kept in touch with Herb and would stay with Herb when he came to Boston. This story needs to be told. It often gets a paragraph or two in various UU histories. All I can say is the famous historian's phrase, it's complicated. It's very complicated. And I'm sorry for all the pain that happened. An exciting thing that was happening during this time, and Gaby was in this group, the Arlington Street Women's Caucus. I don't know, can you tell me where in the picture you are? Are you in the top? Turn your mic on.
Gaby's in the lower left as we're facing.
I'm there.
Right there?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was very
Gaby,
young at the time.
Yeah, you would have been. Carolyn Mcdade, I think she originally came as a parish secretary in the church. She's a fabulous musician, the author, the writer and composer of Spirit of Life and many other hymns. I first knew this album. I did an internship at the Library of Congress in the Archive of Folk Song in 1976. And back at the time, you couldn't get much about women's folk music. That was the very beginning of women's studies, and we didn't have indexes about women in certain areas. So the Library of Congress published my work. It was a bibliography of women in American folk song. And this album was in my bibliography. And I remember typing, Songs of Liberation, Arlington Street Women's Caucus. I didn't come to Boston till the 90s. I was in other places in Mass, but I very much listened to the album and very much wanted it to be a part of the bibliography. Carolyn Mcdade did amazing work. She was part of the group that wanted to change the language to be much more inclusive. A lot of the people here didn't get there by being polite and sweet. They had to be very assertive, sometimes aggressive. They led occasionally outrageous services that included things like women's body functions. Phyllis told me wonderful stories of her early years as a UU and some of the wonderful goddess, witch, just wonderful rituals. And Phyllis taught cakes for the Queen of Heaven when I was early. Carol, you were in that class in 1994, and we heard a great deal about the evolution of the women's movement. But Carolyn was key, and this group traveled all around, really making waves. I love them. Here's their second album, Leave the Breads of Burning. Gaby, are you on this album? Back of this cover?
Yes, I'm right over here
I can't.
on the left-hand top corner.
Left-hand top corner.
Oh,
There's
yeah.
the- Okay. Oh, that's why we have the arrow there. My bad. Okay, you must have told me that before. I missed it with all the red on the cover. Thank you. So this is a very interesting photograph. After Malimu Imara left the church, that was the low point I alluded to, called ministry by the members. I think the church could have closed if the UUA and the district hadn't thrown a great deal of resources, money. They had to sell the building next door at the time, which had provided so much meeting space and kind of shrink. Well, they were small then, they could shrink back into the church. It was a hard decision. Phyllis was the one who told me a lot about that. But after that difficult time, they were able to call Victor Carpenter, the man in the center. And here he is with his two predecessors, Jack Mendelsohn on the left and Dana McLean Greeley on the right. Three people who contributed a great deal to UU. Victor Carpenter, whom I did have a chance to meet and interview, he came to my house and looked over archival materials with me. I helped him with some early Black liberation UU materials for one of his books or something he was doing. He was a wonderful guy to talk with, knew a lot of history, of beloved memory today. His work in the world was international economic justice. He often traveled to distant places. He did a lot about divesting us of South African stocks at a time when that was very much tied to justice. We have many of his sermons, as we do from quite a few of these 20th century people. Most are at Harvard Divinity School. A few may still be in our archives. He's interesting, and he led, I guess I'd heard a little bit about how he could be controversial, but in general, he kept the church going after a very tough time. So a lot of his papers are also in both sets of archives between Harvard and the church. Now, there's somebody in this picture that people who've been around, say, 10 or 15 years will recognize. That's Joan Goodwin. I still miss her. It was interesting. My cousin is on this call, and he's the historian of the church up here, our church in Ellsworth. And he was doing a presentation of that church's history and who came to, who assisted them through the dist work and through extension service. But Joan Goodwin was mentioned in my cousin's historical talk supporting the church I go to today. She helped us write the Channing ordination drama. Here she is at Victor Carpenter's ordination or installation, because he'd had other pulpits. And banners were a big part of the church at the time, of many churches, not just GA banners, but inspirational banners. I remember I used to see them at many churches I visited, but nice to see Joan. Here's an interesting picture of Jesse Jackson with Victor Carpenter. And I remember when I first came in '94, is this gentleman's name Derek or Desmond? Something like that. He signed for people. He often used to sign Kim's sermons. I don't know that we had a lot of deaf people coming. Kim, what is this signer's name who used to sign for you? Do you remember Derek, Desmond?
Yeah, I'll get it in a minute. Definitely.
Yeah, you will. Anyway, he was wonderful. Anyway, this gentleman was well into Kim's term, signing for us. And yes, Betsy, you were always there, and that probably meant a lot to you. This is another fairly long story, but we offered sanctuary in the church. Now, I wish I had my old notes that are at the church today. There was a couple of different iterations of sanctuary, but this was a draft resistor who several of the draft resistors felt like they would claim an ancient right of taking sanctuary in a church, but the FBI didn't see it that way and they dragged him out by his clothes. I believe he was living there for a while, perhaps back in the room that the church administrator often used next to the Carol Smith room. But I wish I knew more about that. I'm aware of it. It's well documented in our clippings, but that was another time the church was in the news and many people in the community were not very happy with us for providing sanctuary. During this era, the chapel was renovated. I guess it had just been used long and hard since it was created in the 1920s. And in the late 80s, it was all done over and made quite beautiful. By the time I came in 94, it was one of the showplaces in the church while the sanctuary was looking a bit shabby until the 2001 renovation. Now, I don't have a current Friday night supper picture. I would have had to get it out of papers I don't have. I grabbed a new picture off the internet because I felt like we just couldn't go through this period without talking about the Friday night supper. The Hardenbergs used to talk a lot about this. They helped found it in 1984 by both people at ASC and Dignity, which was a gay Catholic group. And I'm told it was not at all easy to be a gay Catholic in this era. And this was one of the major social justice efforts. Many of you have worked at it. I love the way they call the people who come guests. And are so respectful. They will put up meals to go for people who are paranoid or can't come into a space. What are you folks doing during COVID about this? Are you doing boxed meals?
Boxed meals served at the great doors.
Oh, that is awesome to keep the tradition going because I believe it's unbroken going back to 84. This was another celebration, 1979, the 250th anniversary. So I think the church has always been historically conscious, but these anniversaries have been a time to come together and look at what history we have, go do some more research and save it as best we can. What's interesting here is the speaker is James Luther Adams. When I first came to ASC in 94, I would say about the third week I was there was his memorial service. And Kim said, Holly, you're interested in history, you must go. She said, you will see the greats of UU who are alive today here to honor James Luther Adams. And I just sat there in awe watching this procession of clergy honoring this wonderful man who late in his life was a very active member. I believe the Richters drove him to church every Sunday for years. So we also celebrated the 275th, but that is past the beginning of the 21st century. Let's see here. Now, gay pride was awfully important. The bells were rung. The church quickly became identified as a haven where gay people would be welcome. A lot of this goes back to the Women's Caucus, welcoming lesbians and straight women working together. The church was sort of a haven. The Gay Pride March has been associated since its earliest days, and I believe always goes by the church. The bells are rung. So this is an early 1982, but the first one was 79. I've watched many wonderful pride parades from the steeple or helped ring the bells. Here you are, Kim. These are the earliest pictures I could find of you visiting us. 1988, I think, are the top pictures. I don't know if you were candidating then, and an interview early on. I love these pictures. You'll see here that in the pulpit, we used to keep the Channing and Gannett statues up there. I think those were moved elsewhere quite a long time ago. And here's, Kim was interviewed for Yankee Magazine. We do have those in the church archives. They're well indexed. There are several copies. It's a wonderful story because she told her vision for the church. I think that was where Kim said, that she did not want to be the minister of a gay church. She wanted to be a minister of a beloved community working together for justice, including justice for gay people, straight people, all kinds of justice. I think it was from that article. I think you had a wedding in the late 90s, as we did. I'm thinking ours was in 97 and yours was in 98 on Valentine's Day, Kim and Kim? Your
99.
wedding?
99.
99, okay. Yeah, and we were close there too. We having services of union because it wasn't legal yet. They were quite wonderful. I remember singing at Kim and Kim's service of union. Now, I mentioned that there were renovations in 1911, another one in the 60s that we didn't learn about for a long time. This is the one that came about rather suddenly when the people examining the steeple said, "You've got trouble." I got involved with the Capitol campaign as a very new member and thoroughly enjoyed it. But we did eventually get that scaffolding up. It's covered with scrim, something green. This picture wouldn't even fit in my camera of the era. I wanted to show it, but it doesn't even show the top of the steeple. That was the before picture. And this here on the right, the clock has changed. All those moldings have been carefully recrafted. There's yet another new weather vane. The brickwork has been made stable. Well, that was 96. I guess we're getting on almost 25 years along, and I know you're doing another capital campaign. I have a few pictures here because I am going to end at 2000 since that was what was advertised. But I had this amazing opportunity. Now, the backstory is I had a terrible bicycle accident in late October or early November 96. And I was out of work recovering from a fairly terrible concussion. I wasn't supposed to be going down to church. I couldn't drive. I wasn't supposed to be on the T. I somehow made my way from our place in, I want to say Cambridge at the time. Yeah, we were living in Cambridge. And I got invited to go up and watch them install the new weather vane. One little part of me said, "Holly, this is not a good idea with a concussion." And another bigger part of me said, "When will I ever get another chance like this?" Tori had quite a few choice words for me when she found out. Here are some of my pictures that I took on that fateful day when I was able to go up there. On the left is the old clock. It was so fascinating to see it close up, and there was a door in it so they could reach out from inside and fix the hands for daylight savings. I loved that. I never had seen it close up. Here's looking out through the scrim and being able to touch some of those ornaments we only see from the street. Here's looking into the building next door, the one that's mirrored, and actually watching the steeple work going on just above me. This is the phenomenal view from up there that very few ever get to see above the level of the bell tower. These steeplejacks were awesome. With no harness, they would jump from platform to platform with, what is that, 190-foot drop at the top of the steeple? They would literally jump around with minimal protection. I sat. The minute I got up there, crawled up on all the stairs, I sat and didn't move. Tori said it was the only smart thing I did that whole day. But here are the guys, they've got the new weather vane all wrapped up and they're installing it. So I had the greatest pleasure of sitting there with my concussion, watching this and feeling rather naughty. So we have reached, I got through 90 slides. It's 10 after 7. I can't believe I called that correctly. Kim, I imagine you've been collecting a few questions. I am going to stop screen sharing so we can see each other. And I'm open to questions.
You can unmute yourself if you have a question.
George does.
When Jim Reeve was attacked in Selma,
Who else does?
Bob Holler was with him.
Who?
Bob Holler left
Bob
early.
Holler.
Bob Holler. He left early and went left. They came out and turned right, and it haunted him all his life that if he had turned the other way, it would have been him.
Holly, let's see. Misty's got a question. She wanted to know what specifically led to the troubled period in which there was no minister.
Okay, that was the ministry of Malim Imara. And I think I talked a little bit about him coming in on a rather low vote that no clergy member I know today would take a pastorate on a 59%. Most of you want something more like 99%, I think.
Yeah.
And so he walked into a divided church. Some people were ardent that we have got to get Black ministers in the pulpit. And it was so hard to do. It's hard to do today. And that's what Mark Morrison Reed has documented so articulately. And you can read about that. And this is in there just in passing almost. But the church, so many people left the church. Part of it was his anger. Now, I can't say his anger was unjustified. I would never say that to any Black person. I think as a minister, he scared people. I think he was so trying to raise the consciousness of this rather comfortable white congregation that had called him. They were willing to try. They were willing to grow. I think, I won't say rightly or wrongly, he pushed them way past their comfort zone. George, can you weigh in on what happened at the end of his ministry? Or Gaby, you were there too.
Well, saying that it was a very dark time is true. And we should say that he was Canadian and he didn't share the American experience of slavery and all that. So he was kind of not your typical person that you want to, I mean, it was a different story. But it was a dark time when he left, but for many of us, it was really challenging and exciting because we did our own sermons. I did joint services with Herb Gleason. And I mean, it was just very stimulating to try and keep the place going. And those of us that survived are really happy how things turned out. So
My saving remnant.
The 2 years that it was run by the congregation, they did that out of strength, not out of weakness. They wanted to come together and they felt they were strong enough to get another minister. It wasn't that they were in despair all that time. There was good services going on.
yeah, we all really rose to the occasion. I think all of us that stayed. And it's one of my most vibrant memories of the church, actually.
It sounds like a time of regrouping and regathering. That's probably a better way for me to frame it.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Well said.
I also remember in the very first worship committee meeting I ever convened when I arrived, I was told on no uncertain terms that they would be watching me carefully because they had a lot of feelings about, this is a quote, coming back under the yoke of a minister.
Wow.
All those years later. So I'm with Gaby and George. I think there was a lot to love about that period of time.
And then
And go ahead.
well, and of course, the Victor Carpenter period was not all roses either. That was quite challenging in many ways. So having Kim come along has really made life a lot more peaceful.
And there was an interim after Victor named Farley Wheelwright, whom our elders often spoke of with great appreciation. He served the church before Kim was called or before she came. And I heard from so many elders early in my archive committee days that he had performed such an important healing time.
Yeah, he was great. We actually visited him and his wife in San Miguel to see an eclipse. And he was a delightful person who really sort of smoothed the waters after all the hard times.
Yeah.
He also stayed beyond his interim years at my invitation, and because that's how it's done, you have to make sure to invite, and served a really important role, especially a pastoral role with the congregation. It was lovely.
I do remember meeting him just briefly, but I never knew him well.
And Don Richter is saying in the chat, thank you, Don, the Carpenters, meaning Victor and Kathy, rebuilt the church. And Don, thank you for your pun.
Easy when it's stolen.
Yeah. And I mean, all of the colleagues who came before me were so generous and so lovely and helpful.
I just wanted to say that it's thanks to Joan Goodwin that I ever knew about Arlington Street Church, because her daughter, Ann Goodwin, was the first person to bring Joan to the UU before she, I think before she was working for the UUA. And Joan Goodwin is, so I came to Joan Goodwin's husband, Bill's memorial service. And I think I heard you preach that memorial service. And one of Bach's famous preludes was played at the beginning of that. And when I walked through the doors, though I might have been there in the late 60s as well, I was like, this is kind of my place.
Oh,
And
that's a
it's thanks-
great story.
It's thanks to Joan Goodwin, who also started the Green Sanctuary Committees, and that's why we have paper plates instead of plastic plates. So that's it.
We
gotta
owe her
go.
so much.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, and not only that, remember she wrote the unbelievable Miss Sarah Ripley, the wife of
Oh,
Emerson.
yes. There's a copy of that in the archives.
Right, right.
Sarah Alden Bradford Ripley, a biography. And Joan just did more than we can ever say. The Women's Heritage Committee, just so much. Joan and Phyllis and Mary Ann were just amazing in so many ways, promoting women's rights, but gently and with a great deal of love.
And their calendars of the women too. Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
those are awesome. The Women's, not Alliance, Women's Heritage Society.
Yeah.
Published those. And we do have some in the archives, a few, not too many.
A funny Joan Goodwin story is that she became the director of religious education for the entire association. And she wanted to teach our kids science and different creation stories, but especially evolution. And so she designed this amazing kit that was sent to homes in far-flung places where there were no churches. And you made a chocolate cookie mix or a brownie mix, and then you crumbled it into a tray, and you hid gummy worms and plastic dinosaurs. And then the sciencey sort of exploration part of it was that the kids would dig with spoons to find the dinosaurs and the gummies. And this was the story in evolution. And of course, all the parents were writing back like, this is the messiest, most disgusting, dinner ruining project. And all the kids are going to remember it forever. And in fact, so many people have come through Arlington Street and said to me, you know, I was raised in, this very far-flung place. And what I remember is this religious education program where I got to dig through chocolate cookie crumbs and found gummy worms, and it had something to do with evolution. But I thought, if I ever get to Boston, I'm going to go to Arlington Street Church.
Great story.
Holly, we are so grateful to you. And there were many comments in the chat. Mine, I think the first of them saying, we love that Tiffany Windows talk. So please know that anytime you want to talk to us, we want to hear you.
At some point, it would help me to get those binders that are particularly the bios of the families and the other archival materials. So if I can get to Boston sometime in the next 6 months and borrow those, I can definitely put together an hour long on the Tiffany families.
Fantastic. We'll get them to you.
Yeah, that'd be great.
All right.
And I just want to say, I hope other people are picking up the mantle. I hear that some of you are. I know the church isn't open and very few are, but I do hope people will dig into a piece of the history. I looked at the whole big picture, but there are so many fascinating people and pieces for either a paper or a dissertation or a thesis. And I just so wish you well and would be willing to be a resource.
It's beautiful, Holly. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Holly.
Thank you,
Holly.
Thank you, Holly.
Thank you, Holly.
Thank you, Holly. It was wonderful.
Thank
Till
you,
next
Holly.
time. Okay, good night.
Memory.
Thank you so much, Holly.
Please visit ascboston.org for more information about this historic Unitarian Universalist congregation. Arlington Street Church, gathered in love and service for justice and peace.